Chapter 1. Cherry Boy. Hello? Mrs. Rodgers, can I speak with Lennox, please? Who is this? It's Amy. What you want him for? I'm his girlfriend. What you say? His girlfriend. At which point my mum, Zena Rodgers, slammed down the phone. I hadn't gotten around to telling Mum about Amy, partly because it had all been so harmless. It had been 2 days ago that, sitting together in a park, Amy had looked at the ground and whispered, "Am I your girlfriend now?" I'd mumbled a word that vaguely sounded like yes. She was very pretty. Also, she was white. That was a real bonus for an 8-year-old boy from the Caribbean. A smile lit up Amy's face. We kissed, exchanged numbers, held hands, an innocent, nervous start to a sweet child romance. But to Mum, innocence was the last thing she associated with this news. The word girlfriend and its many lustful associations was swirling around in her head. She had inherited a strict and uncompromising view of the role of a young boy in the family hierarchy, one that was reinforced by the no-nonsense leaders at her church. The efficient running of a large household, 10 of us were living in a 4-bedroom council property in Wood Farm, Oxford, required rigid discipline and everybody understanding their place. As her youngest child and her only son, my purpose revolved around being seen but not heard, obeying my parents' every command, disciplining myself by always doing my homework or reading books to show an interest in getting an education. On top of that, doing my share of what seemed like mundane, pointless chores, mainly at weekends when I yearned to race around outside with my friends, pretending to be James Bond or Tarzan. I'd be given a long list of instructions that took priority. Cleaning and re-cleaning the skirting boards to eliminate the faintest evidence of dust or grime was perhaps the least annoying of my duties, simply because it was so mindless. As she smashed the phone onto the cradle, I was carrying at the far end of the hallway door. My instinct was to flee and hide, but my leg muscles weren't responding. I heard my mother emit a guttural sound brimming with disgust. Now she was striding towards me. For a moment, my panicky mind imagined I was in an episode of The Twilight Zone, and she was undergoing a terrifying mutation. With every step, her arm muscles swelling and her body transforming into something taller, stronger, more deadly. "Why, you think you're a man?" she yelled. "Why, boy, think him a man?" One boy who thinks he's a man. I said something sarcastic in reply. I don't recall what. "You're too rude and out of order. About you talk to me like me, are you a friend? You think you can talk to me as if me and you are friends." Without warning, she slapped me on the side of my head, a clean, sharp smack, no echo. Still rooted to the floor, I stared back defiantly. Mum hit me again, this time more powerfully. In her wrath, she never stopped after 2 blows. I'd never been in trouble before over a girlfriend, but this certainly wasn't the first time my conduct had fallen short of her lofty expectations. Muddy and ripped clothes, returning late from school, playing truant from church, no manners and respect, being rude and out of order, being a liar and a thief, and more. Each transgression was to her cast iron justification for punishment, severe punishment, physical punishment, always physical. Now she was unleashing a frenzied torrent of blows, the force of each slap and punch intensifying as if that would reinforce the message that I was out of order. I noticed 2 of my sisters sitting on the staircase, just out of Mum's eyeshot. They were slouched forward as if they had just come to the climax of a good film. All that was missing was their popcorn. They got pleasure from seeing my beatings, and they smirked in agreement of my punishment. They used to say to me, "Boy, you must love licks. Boy, you must love getting beaten." They thought that I was stupid to keep getting in trouble, knowing the consequences. Then a jolt of pain across my knees, sharper than any of the blows from Mum's hands, snapped me back to reality. Mum had unbuckled her belt and was using it to ramp up the severity of the beatings. Stubbornly, I refused to cry out or to plead. Instead, I imagined my future self, age 16, burly, muscular, endowed with upper body strength greater than that of any other family member. My situation was agonizing, but it was time-limited. One day, I would have the power to fight back. I often found this a comfort when suffering under punishment beatings. You're a naughty boy, Lennox. Such a naughty boy. You're a naughty boy. Mum was using the belt to whip not just my legs, but my entire body. The leather caught me across the cheek, and I raised my arms to protect myself against the next strike. I must have clenched my fist because she flinched as if I'd been about to launch a retaliatory punch. That was when she summoned reinforcements. Mac, she shouted. My dad, Mac Rodgers, had been fixing something in the backyard, was immediately on the scene. Outwardly, Dad appeared the typical respectable, first-generation migrant. He was tall and not too religious, almost always attired in a freshly pressed single-breasted suit, but in an old cardigan and trousers for doing chores and DIY. His diligence in the workplace enabled him to hold down long-term employment as a porter at a nearby mental hospital. Yet he, like Mum, regarded violent beatings as a routine solution for dealing with an unruly young boy. Their motto, to me, was, "Boy, if you not hear, you go feel. Boy, if you don't hear or listen, you will feel." I hadn't planned on the feel part, but it was what I seemed to get on a daily basis. "Him disrespect me," explained my mum. "Him think him a big man. What gal call here and talk about girlfriend. The boy think him a man and raise him hand to me and want fire lick after me. He disrespected me. He thinks he's a big man. One girl called here and was talking about girlfriend. The boy thinks he's a man and he raised his hand to me to hit me. Dad was a man of few words. The boy raised him hand to me. The boy raised his hand to me. Mum shouted again. Dad is kissing his teeth, screwing up his face and his fists as the accusations mount. I had no opportunity to deny these allegations before my father grabbed my head using both his hands. "Boy, a botheration you give me. Know who you talk to and know your place," he grimaced. "Boy, are you giving me badness?" That means only one penalty. Be aware who you're talking to and know your place. Then, as if it was the most normal thing in the world, he smashed my head against a wall. I shrieked at the searing pain, and the sickening thud of the impact rang in my ears. My temple had clipped the corner of a framed photograph of St Vincent, which fell from its hook onto the floor. I stumbled, but somehow retained my balance. Then an odd thing happened. The shock seemed to numb the pain I was feeling, and at last my legs summoned the energy to propel me from the scene. I staggered up the stairs where my sisters still sat enjoying the show, and for some reason lunged into my parents' bedroom to seek refuge. But still dazed, I wasn't quite fast enough. Dad jammed his boot inside the doorframe, defying my pitiful attempts to shut myself in. My recollection of what happened next is blurred, a series of disjointed fragments. In my mind's eye, I see my dad's fist striking down on my head. I remember collapsing to the floor. I feel the cold metal of his belt buckles slashing against my back, my thighs, my arms, my face. I still carry a scar above my left eye. I hear my own blood-curdling screams. I'm aware of my mum, finally realizing this has gone too far. Trying to restrain her husband, begging and shouting at the top of her voice. "Murder! Murder! Murder, boy! Mac, tap, you gotta kill him. You gotta kill the boy, tap." I sensed the presence of my relative, Thomas Brown, imploring my father to control his temper. Then I'm aware that although my mouth is open, I can no longer scream out. I'm losing consciousness. I can no longer distinguish between the faces in the room. All is black. When I awake, I'm sitting in my bedroom with my relative, who's applying a steri strip to the cut above my eye. My arms are a mess of welts and bruises, and every time I try raising my hand, a sharp dagger of pain through my body forces me to be still. I don't leave my bedroom for the rest of the day, while my 7 sisters share the 2 bedrooms. As the solitary boy, I have a room to myself. But it's barely a bedroom, in reality, a converted box room, and there's barely enough gap between the bed and the wall to stretch out my legs. And today the room was more claustrophobic than ever. Through the window, I could glimpse the world beyond my confinement. Pedestrians and cars and trees, wood farm roads stretching away from the oppressive aura of my parents' home. But towards what? A world of freedom and adventure and joy. Or simply towards further, unremitting misery. The year was 1971, when society regarded child beatings with a detachment that bordered on indifference. Our neighbours were aware of the suffering I endured. The houses were tightly packed, and my piercing screams were an almost daily occurrence. On one occasion, a nearby resident found me walking the streets late at night, naked and dazed. But rather than offer comfort or make inquiries, I was simply returned to my home, where a special course of beatings awaited. Some viewed my parents' attitude to household discipline as a deep-rooted feature of the Caribbean culture, which had an element of truth. Although the violence was excessive, even by St Vincent standards, on 2 occasions my screams so blood-curdling that concerned neighbours felt obliged to contact the police. Each time the outcome was the same. An incurious officer made perfunctory inquiries, spoke mainly to my parents rather than to me, and concluded that since this was a domestic, it was beyond the scope of law enforcement to interfere. It wasn't only during the adrenaline rush of beating that Mum called me Naughty Boy. She used it as my nickname whenever she mentioned me to people within the community. At church, I think more members of the congregation knew me as Naughty Boy than as Lennox. Even one of the church elders greeted me on Sunday mornings by exclaiming, "Hello, Naughty Boy." Over time, unremitting use of this nickname had an effect not unlike the sound of water against tile from a dripping tap. I came to accept it as my fate. If everybody thought I was a naughty boy, surely that must be the essence of my personality. Gradually, but inevitably, and often obliviously, I started to conform to my caricature. Of all my sisters during this period, I only enjoyed a close relationship with Angela, who was closest to me in age. For as long as I could remember, she possessed an artist's knack for captivating imagery and design. She'd spend hours sitting in the house or the street sketching anything that caught her fancy. Her pen portraits were stunning in their simplicity and beauty. Alone in the family, Angela felt a degree of sibling responsibility to help me find my way. She guided me in smartening up my appearance, explaining the things that girls like. As I grew older, she helped me select fashionable shirts, a good haircut, and nice toiletries, and she avoided becoming an accomplice whenever my more manipulative sisters were staring my parents against me. Yet even Angela reluctantly sensed I was on an inevitable path of self-destruction, which nobody, herself included, could correct. "You must love licks," she once said, "because you keep doing wrong." The other sisters were more inclined to mimic my parents' behavior than leap to my defense. Vanessa, one of the oldest and most dominant, once laid into me and tied me to a tree in our backyard because I'd helped myself to some food without asking, before beating me with a slipper, stick, and a coat hanger. "Why? You're too licorice. Boy, you're too greedy." Vanessa was convinced I deserved licks and believed punishment would help to beat the bad out of me. If I objected, she parroted the same lines used by my father and mother. You is a crook. You are a criminal. Or more poetically, you is a liar and a thief, and your tongue will catch fire, and you gwine burn in hell. You are a liar and a thief, and your tongue will catch fire, and you will burn in hell. Clear-cut, unambiguous, almost ritualistic. Even after the most vicious beatings, such as the one provoked by Amy's call, my parents never spoke a word of apology or regret. For a casual observer, we could have been any regular family in the land. Until the next time I was seen to have breached the rules, at which point the entire brutal cycle would start again. It was a torrid childhood, and inevitably the beatings and insults were counterproductive. I turned inward, but never felt that the fault lay with me. Never once did it occur to me to apologize or to conform with my parents' absurd and hypocritical demands. On the contrary, as the months passed, my frustrations built. I hardly spoke again with Amy since our gentle friendship had been the catalyst for so much trauma. But the sting of Dad's belt buckle had seared my psyche more than it had blighted my flesh. Confined to my room, sobbing into my cupped hands, an array of new strange emotions welled up inside. No longer was I being eaten with frustration. No, after being beaten with such savagery for something so trivial, the frustration was morphing into resentment, and the first early stirrings of rage. Rage was taking hold, and yet it's scarcely fathomable that only 5 years had passed since I'd been called Cherry Boy, meaning sweet boy, by friends and relatives throughout the Caribbean island of St Vincent, on account of my cuteness and cheerful disposition. Although born in England, in fact the only family member with this birthplace, most of my first 3 years were spent in St Vincent. My dad had left the island in the late 1950s, believing, as did many others of his generation, that England offered unrivaled opportunity for prosperity, fulfillment and happiness. As soon as he'd saved enough to afford a second ticket, Mum had joined him in Oxford, leaving my 7 sisters in the custody of various cousins and aunts. I imagined that for both of them, settling into their new life was uncomfortable and sometimes perilous. They'd left behind a world where they enjoyed status and stability, for one that was baffling, broken, and unwelcoming. Those unrivaled opportunities were notable by their absence rather than their abundance. Even finding their first accommodation would have been an ordeal. Many guest houses in that era posted notices on the front doors declaring, "No blacks, no Chinese, no Indians, no Irish, no dogs." As the years passed, it was apparent that Dad was struggling to cope with the changes of an alien culture and yearned to return to a more familiar homeland. To this day, it astonishes me that they both made such an effort to persevere. I was born in 1963, the year of Beatlemania, I Have a Dream, and the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Driven by her pride and surprise at finally birthing a son, I was barely 6 months old when Mum decided we should return for a short spell to St Vincent so she could showcase me to the extended family like a prized trophy. We set sail as soon as arrangements were finalised and remained on the island for the next 3 years. A sovereign country in the southeast of the Caribbean Sea, St Vincent is one of the most densely populated, but also one of the most idyllic islands in the region. It's dominated by thickly wooded volcanic mountains, and ash from a 1902 eruption is said to have enhanced the soil's fertility, permitting cultivation of many exotic fruits and vegetables. Bananas have long been the island's leading exports, with sweet potatoes, coconuts and plantains also widely grown, and it remains one of the world's few arrowroot producers. At various times, St Vincent has been a colony of both British and the French empires, meaning that both languages are widely spoken by the population, as well as local dialect called patois, essentially broken English. During my infant years on the island, it was still officially a British colony, albeit on the verge of achieving associate statehood status, and then full independence in 1979. As with many Caribbean islands, St Vincent's demographics reflect the policies and practices of its former colonial masters, in particular around the slave trade. 2/3 of the 110,000 strong population are of African descent, transported across the Atlantic to work on plantations. Dad belonged to this community, although his choice of wife had been in defiance of both tradition and expectation. At just 19, Zena had been half his age when they were betrothed. More controversially, she belonged to St Vincent's Indian community. Racism was rife on the island at the time, and I respect the courage of both my parents in shaping their own future rather than bowing to convention. To minimize rejection and antagonism, I understand it was even necessary to disguise Mum's heritage on official documents, especially the marriage certificate. The Rodgers family's farmhouse was a sprawling residence a few miles from Kingstown Port. I remember its improbably high ceilings and flamboyant pink exterior. The grounds were rich with herbs and fruit, mangoes, rose plum, and of course bananas, and we let our goats and chickens roam freely, constrained only by their fractious, wary relationship with our 6 excitable and protective dogs. With its tropical climate, open spaces, occasionally thunderstorms, and 200 species of bird, it's no wonder the island's anthem starts, St Vincent, land so beautiful, and as a young child I delighted in this abundance. Although even at that tender age, I winced at the rudimentary nature of the sanitation facilities. Our farm had a single outside toilet, which consisted of a toilet seat on top a large hole, devoid of any sewage collection apparatus. The local school was close to our house, and in the afternoon I'd sit on our front porch waiting for groups of pupils to pass by on their route home. As soon as they came into view, I sprinted to the gate, beaming with pleasure as the school children gathered round, enchanted at my sprightly personality, making an almighty fuss over me. "Cherry boy, look nice today. Give me a cuddle, cherry boy. When you get big, you can go on to school and the teacher them go and love you. What you call your dog, cherry boy? What do you call your dogs, cherry boy? You want a sweetie, cherry boy? Cherry boy, tell your sister them we say howdy." If my smile had been any wider, the top of my head would have fallen off. Even when they teased me, it was always good-humoured and without malice. With such a large family, Mum found it hard to maintain a full stock of clothing for every child and every eventuality, and it wasn't unusual for me to be playing in the yard in a hand-me-down dress. "You shouldn't be wearing girls' clothes, cherry boy," the school children chuckled at the gate. When I passed on this message to my mother, she wrapped her arms around me in a glorious and loving hug, exhibiting a level of affection that seemed to desert her in subsequent years. "You're me one son," she laughed. "Okay, I won't put you in your sister's dresses, but me no have no more clothes for you, 'cause them I wash." I adored the company of our animals, especially our dogs. They gave me and all other members of our family protection, yelping with excitement whenever we reappeared after a trip, slobbering with excitement, hoping we brought them some food. No matter how long we played, they never grew bored as they enjoyed this unusual relationship between owner and dogs. Deciding what to call a new dog, the more outlandish the better, was always a major occasion. After 50 years, I don't recall the names of the dogs during my first stint on the island. But on later visits, I met Tiger, Gypsy Girl, and Black Man, and many others whose names I can't recall. If it seemed too good to be true, it probably was. I was too young to appreciate it at the time, but there had been a serious altercation shortly after our ship docked. Mum had arrived, unannounced, at the homes of the relatives who had supposedly been caring for her daughters, only to learn that some of them had been treated little better than servants. Dirty, subdued, malnourished, they were barely recognizable as the lively, exuberant children she had left behind. St Vincent life and culture were visible throughout my parents' Oxford house, from the clutter of ornaments and pictures of family in St Vincent and their younger years to the plaques in the lounge, on which were carved scriptural verse, to the protective plastic laid over many of the carpets and settees. The kitchen had 2 pantries where the shelves were crammed with divine spices and sauces required for Caribbean cuisine, alongside oversized and colourful enamelled cookware. Once a week, my mother liked to spend the morning baking traditional Caribbean breads, light banana fritters or coconut buns with a sugary crust, or fried dumplings made from flour, baking powder and butter. I suspect the ability to bake a distinctive and irresistible bread is hardwired into the Caribbean DNA, and despite nearly a decade in Oxford, Mum's ability with a baking tray and oven were undiminished. Invariably, she created more food than could be consumed within our household, despite its size, and I'd be sent on errands to distribute her produce to acquaintances, especially to her friend Thomas Brown, my relative who lived about 10 minutes' walk away. "Take the bread of your godfather, them like the sweet bread," she said one weekend. Mum chose 1 plain and 1 sweet bread, both freshly baked, and wrapped them in kitchen roll, and then called ahead to let the Browns know that I was on my way. I welcomed the opportunity to spend an extended period away from the house on legitimate business, and as it was a mild afternoon, I had stretched out the journey time by taking a detour to avoid local gangs who relished the chance to call me names and beat me up. So whilst avoiding alleyways and some parks, I imagined the gangs were Spectre agents from the James Bond films and The Man from U.N.C.L.E., which brought some fun to what often seemed like a horror movie. In this white fantasy world I was living in, couples weren't shouting at each other. Nobody was hurling racist taunts in my direction. Even the squirrels seemed calmer than usual. By the time I reached the Browns' residence, my spirits were lifted, and I swear there were almost a spring in my step. I rang the bell, and Thomas's wife answered the door. When she realised it was me and saw what I was carrying, she broke out in a lovely warm smile. Her daughter Pauline was standing alongside. "Lennox, please, why don't you come in?" "Thomas, look, Cherry, bring bread and ting for we." Thomas Brown was a slim, bolden man who portrayed an apparent gentleness of spirit. He worked in a car factory in Oxford, and we all knew he adored his allotment where he'd spend hours tending to runner beans and tomatoes. But beyond that, he rarely revealed much. When I arrived with the bread selection, he'd been reclining in his armchair in the front room. It was the sort of household where everyone knew that the deepest, most imposing armchair was his. But no sooner had his wife announced my arrival, than he catapulted himself to the hall and was waving his nose back and forth above the breads, nodding agreeably at their rich aroma. "Pauline," said Mr. Brown, "go ask your mother to make some tea." Bizarrely, he used his daughters to send his messages to his wife, despite all 3 of them standing less than a couple of feet from each other. Although framed as a request, the tone conveyed there was no room for debate. Brown's wife and Pauline scurried away, as obedient as domestic servants in a country manor. There was no doubt about the power balance within this particular marriage. "Carl, when you're ready," he added. "I hope you like them, Mr. Brown," I said. "Mum worked hard to make them nice." "Don't worry about that," he replied. "Now come in and sit here and tell me how you're getting on at school." I noticed he was speaking in English rather than the patois he'd used to communicate with his wife. He gestured towards the sofa. I sat on the middle of its 3 seat cushions and gazed around the room at the polished cabinet in the far corner, and the small table on which were scattered a handful of magazines, and a family photograph hanging on the wall. Thomas, his wife and 2 daughters, Pauline and Lucy, sitting together on a park bench. "Is Lucy home today?" I inquired. "I think she's upstairs doing some homework," Brown said, still standing by the door as if on sentry duty. "She's got a lot to do. It's probably best we don't disturb them." He looked at me with a stare that lingered for a few seconds longer than was comfortable. Then he made to sit down, but instead of returning to the favoured armchair, I suddenly found him seated right next to me. I squirmed with surprise and apprehension, but I wasn't quite sure why I felt such emotions. After all, my sisters and my parents often sat next to me on the sofa. "That's better," he said. "Now we can talk properly. What do we need to talk about, Mr. Brown?" "School, like I said, or perhaps how you're getting on at home, or music, whatever you like." I noticed his leg was almost touching mine, so I shifted an inch to the right. "I'm happy to talk about anything you want," I said weakly. "Long time in know your mother, you know," he said, slipping into patois. "You know that your mother and I have been friends for many years." He spread his hands as if to signify the passage of time, and one of his palms brushed against my shoulder. I noticed he'd adjusted his weight, and once more his leg was against mine. Again I eased to the right, and again, almost imperceptibly, he nudged along in my direction. 2 people shuffling awkwardly along a single sofa. Literally and figuratively, I'd been cornered. "No worry yourself about nothing," Brown said soothingly. "You know, so we all love you long time. We love you too, you know. We take care of you. Don't worry yourself about anything. You know we have all loved you for a long time. I love you too, you know. We will take care of you." Now I could feel his hand sliding along my thigh, towards my groin. The feeling wasn't pleasant. I tried to wriggle away, but didn't want to antagonize him. So trying to be casual, I pushed away his hand. I didn't say anything in case it would seem impolite. "Wharton, you don't want me to touch you," said Brown as if insulted. Stray thoughts were tumbling around in my head, but I still couldn't figure out what was going on. Why was he acting this way? Had I upset him? Was this normal behaviour from a family friend? Was he feeling lonely and in need of some company? I couldn't get anything straight, and all the time he was talking about love and family. If I tried to say something, my mouth dried up and I struggled to formulate words of protest. "Relax yourself," he said. "Me not do you nothing, boy. Me just show you me love you." Now his hand was in my groin area, stroking me through my trousers. He had tucked his thumb inside the rim of my trousers so that it made direct contact with my flesh. The harshness of his grope was jarring and finally enabled me to give vent to words that had been swirling around and formed in my head. "Please stop. I don't like it." "Why? Don't you like it?" "I don't know. I'm really sorry." With one final caress, Brown withdrew his hand. But he didn't retreat along the sofa. Instead, motionless, he stared silently into my eyes. I blinked and looked away, yet I could still sense his unrelenting stare burning into me. I glanced back in his direction. His face was twisted into a weird expression, one that I'd never observed before. The corners of his mouth curled upward into something resembling a smirk. His pupils were dilated, his brow was slightly redder than usual with traces of perspiration. Only later did I come to recognize what this look signified. Stubborn, determined, unfulfilled lust. The stillness was ruptured by a tap of a tray against the living room door. It was Mrs. Brown. "Come eat, man," she said.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.